At this point, you'll know the drill here. This is a Zelos review, which means you're going to get to see up close a well-built, interesting watch with a pretty original design. One that'll be released soon, and if history's any indicator, there's a good chance it'll sell out. This time, it's the Thresher World Timer, a true or traveler's World Timer GMT in a lightweight titanium case. And before we get any further, we need to talk about one of the most interesting aspects of this watch, and that's the dial. Because if I don't talk about it now, I know you're just going to ask about it later. If you haven't guessed already, this is the blue mother of pearl version. And because of that, this dial is drastically going to shift how it looks throughout the review. For instance, when you're indoors and you're looking straight at it, it's got this dark, smoky blue look to it. It's actually rather subtle. You don't really notice this mother of pearl effect until there's some more light and the watch shifts its angle a bit. But when it kicks in, showing off some extra color and allowing the texture of the dial to come through. And notice that's happening with the World Timer bezel here, and that's because it's also mother of pearl, something I've never really seen done before. I believe this version, as well as the Adventurine version, use those materials for both the dial and the bezel, with an epoxy coating on top of the bezel just to protect it. Something a little different and a bit innovative. And speaking of Adventurine, that's the version Byron over at En Movimiento got to review. So when you're done here, go over to his channel and check out his take. And one more thing, a little bit of a disclaimer here, and that's that this watch was provided by Zelos and they're not asking for it back, hence the promotional tag at the beginning. Some of you care, some don't. I just like to be transparent about it. That said, let's get to it, and I'm sure y'all want to know what the size is. For this one, they went with a 41mm wide case with a 47mm lug-to-lug. So it's a little bit bigger than their previous Mako and Spearfish GMTs, but not by much. And it is using the newer Miyota 9075 Travelers or True GMT movement. More on that in a little bit. Total thickness here is just under 13mm, which granted doesn't sound all that impressive for a watch with 200 meters of water resistance. Sounds pretty standard. But you gotta put that into context with what other 9075 base watches are doing. And most of the ones I've seen out there are a bit thick, including the last few from Zelos. But with this one, they've really dialed it in, and it's actually one of the thinner 9075s I've seen. And it's going to include an exhibition case back as well as a box cut sapphire crystal. And as I mentioned before, the case and bracelet here are titanium, bringing the whole thing to a light 125 grams, give or take a link or two, which is really nothing for a watch of this size. And on top of that, they added a scratch-resistant coating, just to help keep this tooly titanium finish looking tooly. Now, specs don't always tell you the whole story, but there are two things here in particular I want you to pay attention to. And that's the weight and the total thickness, which again was just under 13mm and a pretty light weight of 125 grams. Because a GMT is essentially a travel watch. And for a good travel watch, you want something that's light enough and thin enough to go anywhere, any time of year, wearing anything. And be comfortable all day doing just that. And with that in mind, I think Zelos nailed it, as the Thresher is one of the most comfortable GMTs I've ever worn, with maybe the Strata Timer being the only one that's a little bit more comfortable, even though it is much heavier. So comfort is a big plus here. Now let's move past the specs and start talking about the design. And I think one way to look at this one is if it were a cross between a Longines Spirit Zulu and a Seiko Sumo in titanium with a World Timer. As the key shape here does seem like that of a Seiko Sumo, mixed with maybe a touch of Samurai, where it's an elongated cushion that is a bit curvy while still maintaining its fair share of sharp angles. And the finish itself is quite interesting here, as it is mostly blasted, and uses some brushed surfaces just to highlight the overall case shape, giving it a rather unique effect when the light hits it, with the blasted sections absorbing the light, and the brushed top here almost acting like a sunburst dial. The same is true with the bracelet as well, alternating between blasted mid-lengths and a brushed H, with only these very narrow polished chamfered edges on the side of the links, and I think that's the only polished bit here. This is definitely not a dressy diver. This is a tool watch, there's no mistake in that. And especially if you compare it to their earlier Spearfish GMT. Honestly, as cases go, this one is a little bit out there. But maybe not too far, and it winds up being very unique and interesting. When you first see it, it's a case that's really going to grab your attention, just for being so different. But believe it or not, when you get used to it, it actually winds up being a bit subtle, keeping most of your focus on the vibrant bezel and the dial. And I think that's true not just on this mother of pearl colorway, but all of them. Now, the crown here is down at the 4 o'clock position. It's a good size, it's easy to use. Flipping the watch over, there's an exhibition case back to check out that somewhat boring looking 9075 movement, which is made just a little bit more interesting with a black custom rotor. Back to the front, and you got the World Timer bezel. We've already talked about it being a mother of pearl insert, so let's just focus on the action. Compared to some, the clickiness here is a little subdued, but the overall action is still pretty good with a 48-hour bidirectional click. As for the dial, well, that's where the Longines Spirit Zulu comes in, as it's also a GMT with Arabics, a pretty unusual design for a dive-style GMT these days. And I think it gives that watch as well as this one a little bit more of a military or field watch vibe to it. One thing that might stand out to you is the Arabics, because they do stand out from the dial. And that's because here they're this LUME type, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. But basically it's a newer technique where they're 3D blocks of LUME. So there's no metallic framing here to hold everything in. And I think that works well with the rest of the tool watch aesthetic. Here it's just pure ceramic phosphorescent goodness with a great amount of depth. And when you put that on top of the mother pearl dial, the indices just look like they're floating on this smoky sea of blue. Beyond the indices, there's a painted chapter ring, as well as a slightly raised GMT track with a yellow and white design. Something that is then further matched with the GMT hand, while the hour and minute are semi-skeletonized bars. And if you happen to be Swedish, you're probably already digging this blue and yellow color scheme. Then at the top, you have the standard applied Zelos logo, as well as a simple cutout at the 6, nicely placed for a symmetric date. But let's go back to the hands, because the hands are perhaps the one area that I have to criticize here. That they are a little bit flat and a little bit short. The flatness is pretty apparent when you see these indices rising out of the dial, and I think the hour hand and the minute hand just seem to fall a little bit short. So that's really my main criticism here. Well, that, and I think you could say that the dial is also a bit busy, at least compared to other GMTs. But with the World Timer bezel, it was always going to be a bit busy. And I think the dial just plays into that. But as a whole, it comes across as a sharp, good-looking, well-organized watch that's still relatively clean, with no logo at the top and no block of text taking up the bottom half of the dial, enabling you to fully experience the mother of pearl, or enamel, or Adventurine. Just depends on what you're looking at. And one quick comment about the movement, because this is a newer movement. It's the Miyota 9075 True or Traveler's GMT movement. There's been a lot of watches with it recently, but again, like I said, it's still kind of new. Now, what I mean by Traveler's GMT movement is that the hour hand here is independently adjustable. So typically with a Traveler's GMT, when you set it, you first set the GMT hand to your home time. After which, you then freely adjust the hour hand, both forwards and backwards, to whatever time you're at. And I think this offers a distinct advantage to when you're actually traveling and you're bouncing through time zones. Again, both forward and backwards. But the downside here is that there is no quick set date. And this is a complaint I've heard from a lot of people, but it's just how these GMTs work. And that's because the date here is attached to the hour hand. So in order to flip the date over, you gotta keep rotating it around. But again, you can rotate that hour hand backwards and move the date back as well. Something you usually don't think about. If I'm being perfectly honest with you guys, if I had to pick between a world timer like this or a normal straight 24-hour type bezel, I'm going to pick that 24-hour bezel every time. Because to my eyes, this just seems much more messy. Visually, aesthetically, I look at this and I see order. Then I look at this one and I just see chaos with names going everywhere. And even though I know it's not really chaotic and it's not random, that's just kind of what I see when I look at it. So, since I'm very left brain, my brain just automatically starts looking at that 24-hour bezel instead. But I gotta admit, there is some nice added functionality with a world timer. That you don't really need to know what time zone every city's in, because it's all referenced here relative to each other. And while wearing this around, I realized that this is the first 9075 based world timer I've seen. And it occurred to me that they actually complement each other quite well. As you know, there are two types of GMTs, callers and travelers. Neither of which is truly better than the other. They each have their strengths and weaknesses. And one of the weaknesses of a traveler's GMT is simply using it like a caller's GMT, using it to keep track of another time zone you're not in. Because in order to move that GMT hand around, you gotta completely reset the watch. But a world timer is used just for that, keeping track of another time zone. For example, I live in Dallas, which is in the same time zone as Mexico City. So I find Mexico on the bezel, rotate it to the GMT hand, and then if I want to know what time it is anywhere else, I just find it on the bezel and look at where it sits on the dial. The only downside is that you got to do that every time you want to know what time it is somewhere else, because that GMT hand is always moving, so you just got to rotate the bezel to keep up with it. But still, I think the functionality of a world timer and a traveler's GMT complement each other nicely. Now, one of the other interesting aspects of this watch is the LUME. And I already mentioned this before, saying that it was a LumeCast type dial, or that the indices are LumeCast. And this is a technique where the entire index is a molded block of LUME, rather than just filling in a metal frame. And from what I know, this is the first watch that Zelos has used this technology in. This is supposed to do two things. The first of which is that we already talked about how it adds depth to the dial, as all the contours of those Arabic indices rise out from it. And this looks especially cool at night when the lights kick in. Because remember, this entire thing is LUME and you can see the edges of those indices glow, giving it a 3D effect even at night. And the other thing that this is supposed to do is to improve LUME performance, as again, it's an entire block of LUME. Now, that's what it's supposed to do. But in reality, well, let me just show you here with my test. And pay specific attention to the other two Zelos watches here, the Eagle 2 and the Spearfish GMT. And as you can see, yeah, the LUME here is not quite as good. I mean, it is Seiko good, kept up with my Seiko diver, but it's not crazy good like the Wise or really good like the Spearfish. And these results match what I saw with the last LumeCast watch I looked at, where that's good, but it's not really good. And the reason I included the Eagle 2 in this test is because it also has a loomed Arabics of a similar size, but here it's using a traditional loom. So if you go back and look at just these two, you can compare how LumeCast works to regular loom. And with that, I think it lasts just a little bit longer, but not necessarily anything significant. Long story short, it's got good loom that'll last you through the night and has a cool 3D effect. But it's not crazy good for longevity. As for the bracelet's great. And I already mentioned that as a whole, the watch is quite comfortable. A lot of which is thanks to this lightweight H-Link style bracelet, which has become my favorite bracelet type. The H-Link type links are very articulating, making it very comfortable, and I just like the look. Not to mention, it's nice to have something that doesn't look like every other watch out there with an oyster style bracelet. On top of that, it's got solid links secured with screws, quick release solid end links, which work really well. And you can say the same with the milled clasp and its on-the-fly adjustment system. Throw in that scratch-resistant coating, and there's not much more you can ask for. Bottom line is that it's a Zelos. It's a great, well-built, original, interesting, unusual watch for a pretty decent price. If I remember right, these are going to start at $629 for the enamel dials, and then $649 for the mother of pearl and Adventurine. which might seem a little bit steep if you're comparing this to some of the Seiko-based GMTs that are out there. But when you look at the 9075s, it's actually on the lower side. And that's even before you factor in the titanium and the scratch-resistant coating. So, it's a great GMT. And I can only really think of maybe one other reason why some might not like it. But it is going to require me to ramble on for a little bit. You see, when I first started looking at Zelos watches, they were great watches for an even better price. And it's been interesting to see the evolution of their designs over the years. As each generation gets more refined and more original, shall we say? And that right there, the creativity, the originality that's going into these could be a stumbling block for some. For this one, or many of the newer releases. Because I think there are some out there that miss the old Zelos. They miss the days of the normal black and blue swordfish and Mako divers. Watches that were fairly standard with a few unique twists thrown in. Which for a long time was really the brand's bread and butter. And if that's you and you're missing those older, maybe more normal watches, well, most of these newer releases have been pretty unique. Many with vibrant enamel dials, mother of pearl, Adventurine, Damascus, etc. thrown in. And with that, if that's you, I can see how Zelos might have moved a bit too far for your taste. But at this point, you all know I'm a little bit weird, and you know I like the more unusual, more interesting things that are out there. And personally, I like where they're going with this. I like what they're doing. I like that their design language has become stronger and helps separate them out from every other microbrand out there. Because these days, it's not just about a great deal, but also a great design. And with what they're doing these days, it's easy to look at this and go, wow, that's obviously a Zelos. Rather than, wow, that's just another microbrand diver. And I think that's the point of why they're going this far. So if you're like me, that you like what you're seeing here, that it's a very different GMT than anything else out there, then this is a pretty easy recommendation. Great watch at a good price. Hard to go wrong with it. Now, as usual, let me know your thoughts down below on this, on world timers, or on Zelos watches in general, especially if you miss the older, more original Zelos watches. If that's you, I want to hear about it. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, do something down below, helps out the channel. I'm Shane, this is Relative Time, and I'll see you next time.